Well,
Hmm.
I've done the impossible by tying it together just now because it's not easy to do. But I think I can say something that will make sense. A lot of Dugin's his project is oriented toward um, the rediscovery of um, how should I put it? Distinct forms of collective and civilizational existence that are not reducible to the Western or European logos. And he has this idea that, of course, there are different logoi. Sorry, I don't know how to say it. The plural of logos,
Right.
logoi, something like that. Um, and I think from a materialist perspective, you can probably interpret the Western logos to be the global institutions of liberalism that were the culmination of, this kind of classical liberal Anglo-Saxon era of world history, right? And what form of collective existence persists and perseveres in the midst of the breakdown of the modern institutions of liberalism or modern institutions of statehood in general? So the Soviet state collapsed, but did Soviet civilization collapse? Were there irreversible things about the Soviet experience that made that such that it's not possible to go back to, I don't know, some kind of liberal democracy or something? Well, clearly it's not possible if you look at today's Russia. And I think a lot of Dugin's thinking is aimed around addressing this fact. So far from being a kind of fascist adjacent thinker, I think he is probably best understood as a thinker who bears much more proximity to a post-communist era. And when I say post-communist, I don't necessarily mean like anti-communist, but just like what are the existential implications we can draw from the collapse of liberalism in the 20th century and the rise of these not necessarily communist, even just illiberal poles around the world, right? And whether they're in the Islamic world or and Dugin himself is not right now, at least, too interested in Marxism. I think
Oh,
that he is now interested in Hegel, more interested in Hegel. He's writing a book on Hegel. And, I'm someone who will be meeting him soon, I believe. And so the Marxist lobby is here with me. But no, I think he's open to it, though. He is open. The Marxism he doesn't that he rejects is the official Soviet form. Because,
right.
well, you can't blame him because the Soviet Union collapsed, right? So if there's a Marxism today, it needs to somehow acknowledge that fact. It can't just dwell in delusion and say, oh, there's nothing that happened. It needs to take into account how is it that the Soviet state, managed to collapse such that all we're left with now is the Russian people. Like, however imperfect they are, however whatever, this is what you're left with. You cannot wield the authority of Soviet statehood over the world or over the Russian people anymore because it's gone, right?
Mm.
But the old official Marxism only had credibility because it was tied to power, right? Because it was tied to that authority, but now that authority is gone, right? So it's that
So,
kind of institutional Marxism, which my interpretation is the legacy of Western social democracy and Kautsky's orthodox Marxism, his project of making Marxism an orthodoxy. Not necessarily that there's something wrong with that, but that specific form of Marxism, which has this notion of progress, where if you're England, you're the most advanced, and if you're Russia, you are, um, backward and so on.
Backwater. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense that you would have that criticism of Klotsky. It also makes sense then that you would regard the Soviet Union, since it failed, as having had problems in the way in which it developed the theory. What about China? Do you regard China as having the social structures that correspond with the kind of digital populism that you think is the future? Or do you regard China as also in some way having deviated, for instance, by going into the agreement with Nixon in the 70s?
I think that what I like about China in the 70s is not necessarily the geopolitics, which are, I mean, I can't blame them because the Soviets were very aggressive toward China at that time, and they were trying to bully them, and they thought China's isolated. They have no friends. What are they going to do? So I don't blame them, but what I like is the realism. I like this radical and ruthless realism that China began to adopt, which was, it seems like the antipode and the complete antithesis of the Cultural Revolution, which is hyper ideology. But it was actually just the dialectical supplement or complement, I would say, that was developing alongside the radical ideologism of the Cultural Revolution. So too arose this radical and ruthless realism, which I think was there in Marxism from the beginning, but was somehow lost. And China's hyper-realism, whatever we want to call it, where, there is an objective nature of statecraft and of international relations that is irreducible to ideology. And I think there's a common theme you might be discerning here, right? There's an objective, for example, there's an objective triumph of socialism, regardless of whether the institution of the state is gone or collapses. There is a new logic that's objective taking hold, and this is the realism I think China adopted at the time. And realism is not necessarily cynicism. It's also called in Marxism materialism, right? But in any case, I don't blame China for the decisions they made in the 70s and that period. Although China did not, they really China, okay, I don't want to say something offensive. China had some kind of Oedipal relationship to the Soviet Union because the Soviets gave China the logos of communism, so to speak. So all the original foundation of the construction of the Chinese the People's Republic of China, that was constructed with the direct assistance of Moscow, right? They sent engineers, they sent specialists. The Chinese communists were trained in Moscow. The Soviet Union was like it was a holy land for the Chinese communists, right? It was like it was the big invincible power. So when they ended up having grievances with the Soviets, it took on a quite Oedipal form, actually, like a disappointment in a father, kind of. You want to rebel against them and whatever. But the Chinese did not anticipate that the orientation of history was going in a direction such that the actual Soviet state is going to collapse.